analysis of what is going on in this world with regard to war and peace, the all too many hotspots in the world that find themselves somewhere between war and peace. Dr. Serwer observed that at least the interstate variety of war is in decline. However, American troops have been engaged in war zones ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It seems that the end of the old world order, the Cold War period, brought to the fore conflicts that were seething under the surface and a rash of new situations, new problems that are not easy to solve. So while we hope for and pray for peace, we don't, in this increasingly interconnected world, see very much of it. What are the prospects for peace, and what is the status of the numerous battles that are in the news every day? I'm sure that Dr. Serwer will give us insights into some of the front burner issues in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and Iran. It's important for us to understand more about our unsettled situation in these very unsettling times. Daniel Serwer is a professor of advanced international studies at the Johns Hopkins University, a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, and a scholar of the Middle East Institute. He's been involved in peace-building work in Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, and the Balkans, and served as executive director of the Hamilton-Baker Iraq Study Group. As deputy chief of mission in the U.S. Embassy in Rome in the early 90s, Dr. Serwer led a major diplomatic mission through the end of the Cold War and the first Gulf War. We're privileged to have with us a man who not only is a scholar of war and peace, but a diplomat and a peacemaker. Please help me welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that kind introduction. I've found a warm welcome here in Scranton, at least last night by somebody I hadn't seen in 52 years, Professor Friedrichs, with whom I was in a play. He greeted me last night just before dinner with the words from a play that we were both in high school. I've never been to Scranton before, though I was educated not very far away at Haverford and at Princeton. I need to thank you, Sandra, in particular, for making the occasion to bring me here and to talk to the Schemmel Forum, which I've been assured is a very lively group. And I'm going to say a few words of introductory remarks, but I want you to be thinking already about what your questions are, because I'm going to take your questions before I give most of my talk. I've always regarded it as rather silly that professors talk for an hour and say, do you have any questions? Well, when you announce a lecture called War and Peace, people have questions right away, and why not collect those first? I will point out to you quickly that I do blog almost daily at peacefair.net, and for those of you who haven't joined Twitter yet, by all means join and follow me. That's not right. Oh, okay. 1 second. I have a problem because this somehow got to the back instead of the front. How do I fix that? No. I'm very sorry. 1 second. Let me fix it this way, just by starting from the beginning again. Okay. There we are. I'm going to make, what's that? That's peacefair.net. That wasn't supposed to come up. Here's my agenda. I'm going to make a few basic points. I'm going to then take your questions and I'm going to write them down so that you can test whether I've at least tried to answer them or not. I won't be able to answer them all. We're going to start what a diplomat would call a tour d'horizon in the Middle East and North Africa. We're going to move east from there through the Arabs' spring, summer, and fall to what some would like to call a Persian winter. We're going to then pivot to Asia, and we'll finish up with a few conclusions. But let me start with a few basic points. Violence between states has declined for the last 20 years. And nevertheless, as Sandra quoted me, the United States has had troops in combat zones virtually every year since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has not been a particularly peaceful time for our soldiers, Marines, and airmen, air people, we better start saying. While interstate conflict of the conventional sort has generally declined, problems arising from weak, failing, fragile states have generally increased. We include in these problems terrorism, trafficking of all sorts, drugs, women, children, arms. Those problems have all been on the increase. Political upheaval, exclusionary regimes, ethnic and sectarian divisions significantly increase the risks associated with what we call weak, fragile, and failing states. In fact, those are the factors that will often cause genocide and what's called politicide, murder of particular political groups. But however strong these trends are, and they are strong trends, there's no guarantee that they'll continue. And making these, at least the decline in interstate conflict, continue should be an American policy objective. And the problem the United States has is that it has developed extremely strong military instruments. It has weak civilian instruments for working its way in the world. And I don't say that meaning to be critical of the military, quite to the contrary. I think the way in which the military shapes our role in the world is a positive factor. What I mean to be criticizing is the civilian side, in which I've worked for the last 30 years, which I don't think is in good shape. Now, with those few preliminary remarks, I want to take your questions and challenge myself to try to answer them along the way. And please.
Should the United States and can the United States continue to be the world's policeman?
World's policeman. Should we continue? Please. Stand up. Do me a favor and tell me who you are, maybe what you were in a previous life, and speak loudly so everybody can hear, even maybe the recording, and I'll try to repeat your question as well.
I'm Ricky Hines. I was a clinical dietitian in my former life. I'm now retired, and I really don't know how to present this question, but this is a question that has bothered me for many, many years. And the question is, and again, I just don't know how to phrase it. We are so linked with Israel that I feel that we are being sucked in by their, and again, I don't know the word I want to use.
Are we too attached to Israel? Are we too aligned with Israel?
Thank you. I'll take that.
Please.
My name is Jack Nordell. I'm an historian. The Hagel hearings sort of pointed the great contrast as to opinions on the legacy of the Iraq War, particularly the questioning answers back and forth between Senator McCain and Mr. Hagel. McCain seemed to take it as almost a given that everyone should think that the Iraq War was a good thing, and particularly the surge, and he was determined to get an answer out of Mr. Hagel to that effect. I was just wondering what your opinion is as to the legacy of the Iraq War and what lessons it has.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm saying very little in my prepared remarks about Iraq, but you've already corrected me, and I'll try to swerve in that direction. I've spent a lot of time in Iraq over the last 10 years.
I work here at the University in the Provost's office. I'm just wondering why in our diplomacy over the years we've always propped up dictatorships that run counter to our founding principles.
Why do we prop up bad guys? Please,
Yeah.
Maury.
Yeah, I'm Maury Myers, and in my current life, I'm a husband. I didn't have a previous life. My question is, war and the timing of it. When do we determine that war ends, since we're now in constant conflict? And that creates problems of personal rights and liberties and government intrusion.
You're thinking mainly of the war on terror.
I'm thinking of our continuation of war problems without a conclusion of,
Yeah.
of war. So
Yeah.
the answer is yes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and one that troubles me a great deal, also troubles my son, who's a journalist who writes a great deal about this subject. Well, we'll try to give you an answer. Other questions? Please, David.
David Greetings of the Sociology Criminal Justice Department. There was an op-ed in the New York Times that said we should establish a special court on the use of drones. And I wonder whether you agree or what procedure should be used in terms of oversight of the use of drones. If I'm permitted, one other question. We had a previous Schemmel Forum speaker here who, in the question period, said he thought going forward religious fundamentalism was one of the major challenges. I wonder if Dan would agree with that.
Fundamentalism and drone courts. I had somebody else there.
Joe Segan, retired teacher. If the decision is made for the United States to continue to become the world's police force, do you think, if we consider the current financial situation that we're in with sequestration, would the population of the United States support a draft in order to continue
Okay. Now, there are a lot of issues in that question. I'll try to get to several of them. Please, one more.
Rohim, active grandmother. You have a policy of isolating two of the current rogue nuclear nations of North Korea and Iran, and of virtually demonizing the regimes in that country. However, there is a huge disconnect between the regimes, particularly in Iran, and the people. The population in Iran, I think 60% is under 25, and they really, as I understand it, don't like the regime, either the religious, that. Is this an area where the lack of, the isolation of these regimes is inhibiting the United States policy going forward by working, and is actually this isolationism an effective policy?
Is it really counterproductive?
Yeah.
Great. That's a great set of initial questions. I will try to get to them all. I don't feel completely competent on drone court. But I will try to say something about it. I'm not sure there's anybody competent on drone court issues yet. Let me start with my tour d'horizon, and I'll hit these questions as we go along. here's our world, and there's what we call Middle East and North Africa. And if we show you the countries of Middle East, North Africa, they extend all the way to Pakistan in some definitions, and all the way west to Mauritania. But I wanted to point out in particular this little sliver. Usually when people talk about Middle East and North Africa, they leave out Israel. And that's a sliver that that America has been particularly concerned with, especially in recent years. And as one of the questioners asked, have we aligned ourselves too closely with this little sliver? Let me try to address that question right away. My view is that we have aligned ourselves not so much too closely with Israel, but too closely with one particular set of political parties in Israel, which are the right-wing parties who have not accepted this border. I'm sorry. I didn't even realize that what I've got here is a picture of Greater Israel, not of Israel per se, which there should be a piece carved out here for the West Bank. It's funny, I never looked at it carefully. But this is a picture then of the Israel that some Israeli political parties would like to see emerge. This is a picture of Israel without Gaza and the West Bank. And we have allowed ourselves, it seems to me, to be aligned with the political parties that have doubts about the viability of a Palestinian state. That, to me, is a mistake. And I would happily see us aligned with Israel, but with an Israel that accepts the 1948 borders with swaps as the correct borders of Israel. I think anything else raises questions, not only in Palestine, but throughout the Arab world, throughout the Muslim world for that matter, about fairness, about equity, about correctness, compliance with UN Security Council resolutions. There are all sorts of questions that arise if you don't accept the at least as a goal, that there should be a Palestinian state. And this map happens not to show the Palestinian state. I want to turn to the Arab Spring quickly, though, and say to you that this really is the greatest political upheaval since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that's saying something. A lot of things have happened in the last 20 years. But what you're seeing is a massive political change, not social revolution, but political change in the Arab world. And let me walk through it sort of bit by bit, because I think it's important to understand. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the Arab Spring as a single phenomenon. But the Arab Spring really isn't a single phenomenon. It's something that has happened in different political, economic, cultural contexts, country by country. And it actually has had quite different evolution and outcomes in different countries. So that in Tunisia, what you see is a peaceful revolution, fundamentally. A revolution that took only a short time. The dictator left rather quickly. And the Tunisians mapped out a roadmap for themselves that they are now having a hard time keeping to. They have a constituent assembly that is trying to write a constitution, and they're having a very hard time. And that hard time is caused in part by the emergence of strong fundamentalist, we call them Salafist forces in the Muslim world, that are challenging the Muslim Brotherhood, which had actually won the parliamentary elections in in Tunisia and was governing in a rather inclusionary way. Actually, they're not so much governing as just trying to get to a constitution. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that Tunisia, if there's a model of good things happening, it's still Tunisia, even though they're having a lot of troubles right now. Egypt started the way Tunisia started. It started with a rather quick exit of the autocrat, Hosni Mubarak, but it, in response to a peaceful uprising, that's Tahrir Square on one of its finer nights during the revolution. How many of you have been to Tahrir? No one. You've been during the revolution? No. Well, I was there during the revolution. Not during this part of the revolution. It was a later portion of the revolution. I must say it's quite thrilling, needless to say, to be in the midst of that. It was a peaceful uprising, but it went off track. It went off track, I think, mainly because the protesters made a fundamental error and turned their revolution over to the armed forces. The armed forces had their own interests at stake. They failed to be able to fix a roadmap. The result was a game my colleague Mark Lynch at George Washington University likes to call Calvin Ball. Those of you who read the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes will know that Calvin Ball is a game in which the rules change all the time. They're never the same. And that's an apt analogy to what's happening in Egypt. The rules have changed so many times I won't even try to recount all the changes, but they did eventually elect a Muslim Brotherhood president, President Morsi. The courts annulled the lower house of parliament and it was dissolved. Morsi forced through a constitution which is somewhat favorable to Islamist forces, and he is now taking the country over the objections of the secularist opposition. He's taking the country to parliamentary elections this spring. The elections will actually be conducted not, as you or I might think of elections in a single day, but over a period of 3 or 4 months. In different parts of the country. The reason for this, there is actually a good reason for this. Elections in Egypt are supervised by judges, and they don't actually have enough judges to supervise all the elections happening all on one day. I have volunteered to go as an election observer, as I have on other occasions for these things. We'll see if they really allow international election observers. They're saying they will, but they haven't in the past. The revolutionary government has not always in the past, and they may not this time either. There are lots of doubts about the outcome of this revolution. How democratic will it be? How Islamic will it be? How sustainable will it be? Egypt is a big, important country, and much bigger and much more important in the Arab world than Tunisia is, so these uncertainties are really profoundly important. Let me say a word about Libya. Libya was a violent revolution, not a nonviolent. It started with nonviolent protests, but it turned violent rather quickly, and then the violence had the support of a NATO intervention. It also is having a difficult denouement, and I have to tell you that violent revolutions, so a lot of people will tell you that, you know, there are cleaner results in violent revolutions. It happens not to be true. And there's a very good book called Why Civil Resistance Works, which looks quantitatively at the outcome of violent and nonviolent revolutions over the past 100 years. And it turns out that nonviolent revolutions succeed more often and have more democratic results than violent revolutions. And you see why very clearly in Egypt. The government, in Libya, the government simply can't enforce law and order. It simply does not have what professors call a monopoly on the legitimate means of violence, which is what a state requires to enforce law and order. This led to the murder of an American ambassador and his colleagues in September 2012. And the result, of course, is that Americans have the impression that all of Libya is chaos every day. And I can tell you from having walked the streets of Benghazi and Tripoli twice since the revolution, that that's not at all the case, that in fact this is perhaps the friendliest Arab country I've ever been in to Americans. Literally, when you tell people in Benghazi or Tripoli that you're an American, if you don't want to be hugged, you have to duck quickly because Libyans know who saved them from Gaddafi. Nevertheless, I have some hopes that Libya will come out right in the end. Libya has what Egypt doesn't have. It had a good election in July 2012, remarkably good. I was an observer for the Carter Center during that election, and it was extraordinary to watch how committed the Libyans were to doing things right. They did a clever thing. They turned the electoral mechanism over to the school teachers. And the school teachers opened the schools, and they set up the polling places and did the registration and all of that. And, you know, think of what it has meant to be a school teacher for the last 40 years in Libya. You learned how to follow instructions very precisely. So they had posted on every single polling place wall that I saw, they posted the instructions on how the polling place was to be set up. They set up the polling place exactly as the picture showed you, and they conducted the procedures with not quite military precision, but with real conviction. So they had a good election. They had an interesting outcome. It's rather hard to summarize, but suffice it to say that nobody really won a giant majority in that election, and that's good because, of course, they too need to write a constitution. They never had one under Gaddafi, essentially. They have a small population, only 6.5 million people. They have a lot of money because they were able to start up the oil and gas exports quickly, and they have a large degree of ethnic uniformity. There is some conflict east and west. There is some conflict within the country, tribal conflict in the south. In the west, there's a particular conflict between a group of Libyans who happen to be blacker than most Libyans and who are regarded as having sided with the Gaddafi regime, and they've actually been expelled from their city and are living as displaced people in other parts of Libya. So that they're not without internal problems. They have internal problems, not the least of which is the continuing presence in the country of a large number of people who supported Gaddafi. But nevertheless, the revolution with ups and downs has gone reasonably well in Libya. I won't go as deeply into Yemen. Yemen was a negotiated outcome. It was an outcome negotiated by a group we'll talk about, the Gulf Cooperation Council, with support from the United States and the Europeans. It was not a totally peaceful revolution, but it had a negotiated outcome, which is exactly what we might hope for in Syria. We hoped for it for a long time now, and it still hasn't come about. Syria is a nonviolent revolution, fundamentally. It started 2 years ago. Actually, March 15th is the date of the start of the revolution. And it started peacefully and remained peaceful for a number of months and turned violent only in the summer after it had started. The violence drives things in an increasingly sectarian and extremist direction. Fundamentalists do well in a violent scenario. The Alawites see it as existential. Who are the Alawites? Well, the Alawites are a group. They regard themselves as Muslims. I'll leave it to theologians to decide whether they really are or not. They have some distinctly non-Muslim beliefs, including reincarnation, including the presence on earth of a representative of God. Guess who that is for most Alawites these days? But they are a relatively small group, about 10, 12% of the population in Syria, and they have governed Syria for many decades now. They see no prospect that they will survive in a Syria in which the revolution wins. That's what I mean when I say they see the conflict as existential. The Americans have hesitated to intervene militarily. A lot of people are writing op-eds saying, well, if you intervene in Libya, you have to intervene in Syria. But there are differences between Syria and Libya. The most obvious difference is that Russia and China are not on board for a military intervention in Syria, partly because of what we did in Libya, which they regard as having gone beyond the UN Security Council mandate. But there are other reasons for American hesitation, as too much more profound ones, in my view. And if you listen carefully to President Obama, he said recently in an interview that when he thinks about Syria, he has to worry about a lot of things. And the first thing he mentioned was American withdrawal from Afghanistan. What does American withdrawal from Afghanistan have to do with Syria? The simple answer is something called the Northern Distribution Network, which is an American logistical network used to put forces and materiel into Afghanistan, which is now being used to withdraw them. And the Northern Distribution Network, which is really vital to us because it gives us an alternative to Pakistan, which is a cheaper and easier route, but one which Pakistanis block from time to time. Northern Distribution Network is really vital if we're to get ourselves out of Afghanistan in the time frame that we would like, and it is controlled by the Russians. So we don't want to do anything that offends the Russians too much right now, also because of the Iranian talks with the P5+1, as it's called, with the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. The Russians are in those talks, and we want to keep them in those talks. We need Russia for the sanctions against Iran and eventually for any action we take against Iran. And the Russians have their interests in Syria, and they're not interested in authorizing us to do military action. They use the port. Russian foreign policy has long wanted a warm water port on the Mediterranean, and they've got it in Syria. They sell a lot of arms to the Syrians, and they are very concerned that if the revolution wins in Syria, that extremists, Sunni extremists, will take over. And that, they're afraid, would ignite rebellion also in their Muslim areas. Turks and Arabs have wanted it into Bashar al-Assad as we have, but they haven't done what's necessary yet. Let me move a little bit farther east to the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes most of the major oil producers in the Middle East, where there have been no successful revolutions yet. There has been an uprising in Bahrain that's been repressed. Kuwait is embarked on some more democratizing reforms. Oman essentially likes its king and wants to be left alone. Qatar and Saudi Arabia will tolerate will brook no opposition, nor will the United Arab Emirates. So these are places that have seen no revolution, and we basically support the autocracies in these places. At least we're not prepared to do much to counter them. How does the Arab Spring affect our interests so far? You know, when I look at it, surprisingly little for gigantic political upheaval. We lost a relative friend in Mubarak. We lost an erratic Gaddafi, who sometimes did things we liked, like give up his nuclear program, and very often did things we didn't like, including bombing a discotheque in Germany that led us to take military action against Libya. There's been little risk so far to the kings Abdullah. Those are the kings that both named Abdullah in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia. there's potential damage to Hezbollah if Bashar al-Assad falls, but there the potential gain in Syria may be outweighed by the possibility that Sunni extremists would take over. The one that's talked about most in the press, the group that's talked about most in the press these days is Jabhat al-Nusra, but there are many Sunni extremist groups that are trying to exploit the situation in Syria, some of them affiliated with al-Qaeda or regarding themselves as affiliated. The Muslim Brotherhood has done well in Tunisia and Egypt, but it hasn't done a hell of a lot of damage yet to American interests in the Middle East. Longer term impacts, well, it's difficult to judge, but certainly sympathy for the Palestinians in the Arab Street is strong. If these governments are more responsive to popular opinion, they're going to be less friendly towards Israel than in the past, and they weren't all that friendly in the past. But there is a lot of concern about jobs and the economy as well. So these new regimes are likely to be very heavily focused on their own problems for a while. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is very ambiguous about the treaty with Israel. But the real problems that have arisen so far have nothing to do with their feelings about the treaty with Israel. They have more to do with the deteriorating law and order situation in Sinai, and then with Hamas's increased, what shall I say, boldness in Gaza. Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and other revolutionaries are likely to be tougher on the question of Golan than Bashar al-Assad was. He essentially talked a good line on Golan, but did very little. There are possibilities that the Arab Spring will end in a widespread collapse of state structures in the Middle East. Those structures, of course, are essentially colonial imposed structures. The Sykes-Picot line, which is the border between Iraq and Syria. There are lots of lines drawn by colonialists in this region. And especially the Kurds might want to challenge the state structures, because Kurds live not only in northern Iraq, where we're familiar with them, but also in Syria, also in Turkey, also in Iran. Alawites, how might they challenge the state structures? Well, some people expect them to try to carve out an Alawite parastate, mini-state in western Syria if they're defeated. And, of course, the Sunni extremists who are present in many of these countries are people who don't believe in the state structure and want to restore the caliphate. And the caliphate would cover all the Muslim areas of the Middle East. There are a lot of uncertainties. Will the Arab Spring return to Iran, where it actually started? What might happen in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, especially Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia, you've seen many transitions of kings in Saudi Arabia, so we get used to the fact that they figure out who's going to be the next king pretty easily. The problem now is that they are very close to having to go to a new generation for their next king. And that is expected by most experts to cause them a little bit more trouble than in the past. Morocco and Algeria are trying to forge a reform path, preventing revolution by undertaking some reforms, especially in Morocco. Will that work? Will chaos spread from Syria into Libya, into Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey? That's certainly a possibility. Will Israel face more internal and external challenges? But with all of these uncertainties, I have to say that none of these issues lend themselves readily to American military intervention. So if we are the world's policeman, I'm not sure we got the right instruments. We all know that there are different styles of policing, and repressive policing is one thing, community policing is another. I think of us less as the world's policemen and more as its firemen. And I think that's a role that is hard to avoid, but we'll see in a moment why. Let me move a little farther east and ask about Iran. We've got lots of problems with Iran. Human rights, terrorism, Israel, Lebanon, Syria. But the big one right now is their nuclear program. There was a meeting recently with the P5 refers to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus 1 is Germany, and that's the diplomatic configuration for talks with Iran. The meeting in Almaty, Kazakhstan, went fairly well. I think it was last week. What we need is an agreement that accepts Iranian enrichment but limits its quantity and degree in a verifiable and absolutely strict way. Failing that, I hate to tell you this, but there is a real prospect of war with Iran. And when I talk about war with Iran, I'm talking about American war with Iran. I don't think Israel's going to attack Iran. I don't think Israel can do serious damage to the nuclear program. It can do minor damage, to which the Iranians would respond by accelerating their nuclear program. Vice President Biden said the other day at AIPAC that he renewed the military threat against Iran. I think President Obama has been trying to keep his mouth shut about that, not because he won't do it, but because he's been told that talking about it is counterproductive. And I think that's probably right. He's hoping for a diplomatic solution, but you know, I don't think there's any reason to doubt President Obama's capacity to use military force. He has repeatedly over the past 4 years, and I think he'll do it again, but it's a major, major enterprise to go to war with Iran. Why is all of this so difficult? Well, part of the reason it's so difficult is where Iran is. Those red countries are the GCC countries, the major oil producers of the Middle East, and Iran is right here, and Hormuz is here. And Hormuz is a choke point, an oil choke point through which 20% of the world's traded oil passes. That is an extraordinary quantity of oil, much more than passes through any other choke point on earth. We obligated ourselves in the Carter Doctrine of 1980 to use military force to defend our interests in the Persian Gulf region. President Carter originally issued this, to give you an idea of how long ago it really is, as a warning to the Soviets who had just invaded Afghanistan. This was not a warning to the Iranians, it was a warning to the Soviets. Nevertheless, the US military has now planned for more than 30 years to keep Hormuz open no matter what. The problem with keeping Hormuz is here, it looks a little wider than you might think. In fact, it's only, I think, 6 nautical miles of ship-usable channel. This is the so-called Persian Gulf, and these are the pipelines that surround the Persian Gulf. The green ones are oil, and the red are gas. Now, you might think that having occupied Iraq for more than 10 years, that we would have built pipelines out of Iraq that carried its oil away from Hormuz, but we didn't. Instead, we built, in my view mistakenly, we rebuilt their oil terminal here, which ships oil this way. One of the big challenges for the future is to try to make oil move west, north, and south rather than through Hormuz. The Iranians have the same challenge because though they are oil producers, they are not big oil refiners, and they need to import oil product. And they are considering the building of a pipeline that would enable them to circumnavigate Hormuz. The thing you have to understand about military instruments to keep Hormuz open is this. Anytime you talk about even sending ships to clear mines from Hormuz, the price of oil goes up. The security problem associated with Hormuz is the price of oil. That's what we're concerned about. So anytime we threaten to use military instruments in this part of the world, we do ourselves as much damage as we do anybody else. And in fact, the Iranians celebrate because they get a good deal of income from it. Hastening on, I just want to point out that Hormuz is not only an oil choke point here, but this is the fault line between Shia and Sunni Islam. And so in the world as it is today, this is a battlefront, a religious battlefront, no matter what we do about Hormuz. Iran, Azerbaijan, and Bahrain are the only Shia majority countries. But there are significant, Iraq as well, of course. There are significant Shia minorities in Yemen, in Syria, and in Turkey. And the war between Shia and Sunni Islam, Americans will often ask me, what's that about? And the best explanation that I've come up with is that it's rather similar to the division between Protestantism and Catholicism in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's a quarrel not only over how you practice your religion, because frankly the differences in practice are not all that great. It's a difference over authority and who was the proper line, who inherited the authority of Muhammad is basically the question. But it has dramatic implications for today's world, and it's all about the Persian Gulf and Hormuz. But we're already in Asia in a certain sense, so let's pivot there. It's been big and peaceful for decades. It has a lot of smaller disputes. There are 80 unresolved territorial disputes. It's a very large number. There are two big issues: the rise of China and the rivalry between India and Pakistan. Rivalry is a soft word. The continuing conflict between India and Pakistan. China is becoming quite dominant in its neighborhood, very anxious to protect its own territory and neighborhood from foreigners, recovering its role as the Middle Kingdom. A lot of Middle Kingdom should really be translated, I think, Central Kingdom, because that's the Chinese concept that they're at the center of the world. A lot of what we're concerned about in Asia appears to be in or near the oceans, with the important exception of Afghanistan. India and Pakistan. It's a long-standing conflict. It's a conflict between an Islamic republic, one that has had a great deal of trouble sustaining democracy, and a secular democracy with a large Muslim majority, because there are a large number of Muslims who still live in India. There's a nuclear rivalry involved, and that's a nuclear rivalry between two states who can strike each other within minutes, not, doesn't have the same distance that the Soviet Union and America had. The Kashmir is only one theater of this rivalry, but it's an important theater and one that flares up from time to time, been relatively quiescent recently. Afghanistan is another theater, and we think of Afghanistan as our fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But the Indians and Pakistanis think of it as just another place where they are rivals. And the Indians, it is not irrelevant that President Karzai went to school in India, and the Pakistanis don't like that. And they are looking forward to the competition in Afghanistan when we leave at the end of 2014, or when most of our troops leave. But you know, India and Pakistan are also big economies. The Indian economy in particular has done extraordinarily well in recent years. And the prospects for economic benefit appear for the moment to be trumping the rivalry. There is more trade. There is a trade agreement now between Pakistan and India. And there are some prospects that things could evolve in a positive direction. China is clearly rising. You'll read a lot in the American press about whether the Chinese GNP will exceed that of the United States. How many of you remember the year in which the GNP of the European Union exceeded that of the United States? Me neither. It's a totally irrelevant moment. China is a big holder of U.S. debt. It's expanding its military rapidly. The Wall Street Journal told me this morning that the military budget will go up 10% this year. It has big naval ambitions. But Beijing, so far as the experts can tell, for the moment, seeks not conquest but respect, economic advantage, hegemony. It is not right now challenging the United States or even its neighbors very directly, though there is, and we'll talk about that in a moment, some conflict over some silly islands in the South China and East China Seas. China still has a lot of problems, and I want to underline that because it's not often underlined in the press. They have a terrific real estate bubble. If you watched 60 Minutes the other night, you know all about it. They need 7% growth, that's the normal for them. If they don't get that, they think they're in trouble. They've got lots of social unrest, rising expectations, very rapidly aging population because of the one-child policy. They need to increase domestic consumption. The Wall Street Journal will also tell you all about that this morning. They are trying to do that. They have a tremendously inefficient state sector in their economy. They are water short and have astounding environmental problems, both water and air. They've got a ferocious competition with their neighbors, especially India in the economic realm, and they've got their own nationalism to deal with. A lot of this is taking, you know, the Chinese rise is bubbling up in the oceans, in particular in the South China Sea, which happens to be particularly important for navigation. It has a lot of resources, and there are territorial claims that are unresolved in the Spratlys, the Scarborough Reef, and the Paracels are here, the Spratlys are here, and the Scarborough Reef is here. So you've got a whole series of territorial disputes in a fairly small area. I don't have a map of the East China Sea, but you've read recently about the conflict between Japan and China over the Diaoyu Senkakus, which are uninhabited islands. The China conflicts are manifesting themselves in the sea, but they're really about things that go on land, and in particular about Chinese nationalism, and which is generating a very strong response also in Japan. And anybody who knows the history of these places knows that nationalism in China and Japan can lead in very sad directions. In addition, you have, between India and Pakistan, some deeper issues. Pakistan, in some ways, is a failing state, certainly along its western border. It's plagued by extremist ideology and domestic terrorism, and now Shia-Sunni conflict. The other day, 40 people were killed in a bombing of a Shia mosque. India is taking off economically, but it is really difficult to manage the Indian state, the Indian economy. So what you've got in Asia, it seems to me, is is a lot of deeper issues that have more to do with what's going on inside these states than the relatively minor conflicts we're seeing so far outside. But those deeper issues have real potential for causing serious problems. The question is, what is the U.S. role? What is this pivot to Asia? It's necessary, but it generates a lot of Chinese suspicious reaction. We've got to conserve our strength. There's no way to go to war with China today or tomorrow if we can help it. And we are trying hard to push in the direction of economic cooperation as an answer to a lot of the problems in Asia. In particular, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is under negotiation, which the Japanese are considering joining, the Chinese have not joined. There is a counterpart in the Atlantic with the free trade agreement that will be negotiated in the next couple of years. I end with this partly because I think it illustrates how important it is for all the instruments of American power to be used, not only in Asia, but in other parts of the world. Diplomatic and economic means are part of the answer to these problems. The world is more peaceful, but there are no guarantees. There'll be a lot of uncertainty in the Middle East this year due to Iran, but generally for the next decade, I would say, as the Arab revolution shake themselves out. Asia's long peace is at risk, requiring that the U.S. manage China's rise sensibly. It's not the worst of times, not by a long shot. But keeping it that way is going to require resources and focus, civilian as well as military. And I just list on this last slide a few of the of what I would regard as the civilian instruments that are needed in our current situation. But if you'll bear with me for a minute, I'll try to make sure I've answered all the questions. I think I answered on the world's policeman. I don't think we can be the world's policeman, but every once in a while a fire breaks out, and you got to react to that. We're too aligned, not with Israel, but with certain political forces in Israel. There are lots of Israelis who want the Palestinian state, who see it as a solution to their problems, and we should be supporting them. The Iraq War legacy. It's messy, as almost all post-conflict situations are. But it's still sort of a democracy, and I think it will likely remain that way, but it's touch and go, I would say. Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister, has got a democratic instinct in his body. He's all about power and wielding power. But there are a lot of Kurds and Sunnis and Shia who won't accept a new dictatorship in Iraq. And it'll be interesting to watch the provincial elections this year and then the national elections next year to see if they're able to maintain something like a lousy democracy, let's put it that way. Why do we prop up bad guys? Well, I don't think you have much of a choice when the bad guys, you know, are really in control, and when you look at Saudi Arabia, and when you look at UAE, and when you look at Qatar, and you look at a lot of, but when people take up the cudgels against their dictators, and by taking up their cudgels, I mean non-violently more than violently, I think we have to listen to the people. And I think we did relatively well, frankly, in Tunisia and in Egypt. We moved fairly quickly to separate ourselves from those autocrats. I don't think we've done as well in Syria, but the circumstances were more difficult. We shouldn't prop up bad guys, but we're going to have to deal with bad guys where they exist. What are you going to do with Putin's Russia but deal with Putin until the Russians find a way of dislodging him? How and when does war end? This is a very important question, and the Americans have been very bad about ignoring it. the Iraq war would have been a different scene post Saddam Hussein if we had had a written and signed surrender. We failed to do it because we didn't want to glorify Saddam's generals that way. It was a serious mistake and left the door open to an insurgency that still plagues that country. We should end wars. The war on terror is the toughest one to end. But not ending it has real consequences for you and me, because it means that the government can do things that it wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And I think there's room for a real debate about ending the war on terror. Drone court. We used to think assassination was against the rules. Now we think assassination is just targeting the command and control of an enemy. This is a tough one. I don't think anybody is satisfied with our current mechanisms for deciding who gets a drone strike. But what the proper mechanisms are, I don't pretend to know, and I think we need a debate on that subject as well. Fundamentalism. Look, I don't care at all what people believe in the privacy of their own homes, in their own churches, in their own synagogues, in their own mosques. But if you come out of mosque or synagogue or church and tell me that you want to challenge the state structure throughout the Middle East, or you don't want to allow the existence of a Palestinian state because Jews have a biblical right to all of Israel from the Jordan to the west, I've got a problem with you, because you're talking war and I'm trying to maintain peace. So whether it comes from fundamentalism or from some other ideological source, it used to come from communism, you know, it came from fascism, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's an ideology that undermines the world structure in a way that will lead us to war rather than peace, I got a problem with you. We can't reintroduce the draft. I'll let you talk about this with people more expert than I am, but the military no longer regards 2 years of a draftee as sufficient to enable them to train and deploy people, because war has become so technologically advanced that you need more time from them than that. So the military is not only happy with the professional force, it requires the professional force as an absolute requirement because you couldn't draft people for 3, 4, and 5 years. Sequestration affects all of the above. Everything we've talked about today, it reshapes our military force around the world. It's going to reshape our diplomacy around the world. If we allow it to be done by across-the-board cuts, which is what sequestration does, we will end up with an even more ludicrously illogical, irrational system than we have today. And that would be a mistake in my view, but it's a mistake we seem tempted to make. North Korea and Iran. I'm completely sympathetic with the intent of your question. Shouldn't we be reaching out more to the people of these places? Is isolation of the regimes actually causing us more problems? The answer is yes, but you can't ignore a regime that defies the Security Council and acquires nuclear weapons, which is what North Korea has done, and it's what Iran looks like it's headed to do. We haven't learned despite social media, we haven't learned how to reach out to other people very well. We have the means today. I hear from Iranians and Syrians every day of my life. Through Twitter, through LinkedIn and Facebook, emails. I hear from these people. And you know, I don't accept everybody who tries to friend me on LinkedIn, but if an Iranian at a Security Studies Institute in Tehran asks to friend me on LinkedIn, I say yes. I say yes. And I think we should all be more aware that that kind of outreach is possible. You know, citizen diplomacy is a real movement in this country. I'd like to see it stronger than it is. I'd like to see it more widespread than it is. Once upon a time, to have a pen pal abroad, you had to sit down and write a letter. Today, you just have to send an email if you can find somebody. And it's not hard to find people on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And I do think that we need to do much more, not through government channels. I don't think the solution lies in government channels. I think we need to do much more as citizens to reach out so that other people understand us better and so that we understand them better. That's a good place to end. Thank you very much.
Maybe the draft was not a viable instrument these days, but I think that Schimmel should draft you to come back.
Thank you.
I hope you'll say yes.
It would be a pleasure.
Thank you so much for enlightening us immensely.
Thank you.